mankind lived, just like the animals.
John, you have to jiggle it again, it's stuck.
And something happened, which unleashed the power of our imagination. We learned to talk.
There's a silence surrounding.
Hello everybody, welcome to the Atheist Experience on Murphy Day, where everything that possibly could go wrong, or almost everything has. I'm waiting for one of the cameras.
Man, I'm glad I'm not a producer anymore.
I know. I'm waiting for one of the cameras to go out. Just as a heads up, we've got a screwed up clock, we've got phone lines that may or may not work. We have no connection to the to the mini studio booth, but we're going to go on anyway, because it's public access and most of you probably don't care anyway. Just wanted to, hopefully the phones will be working, hopefully we can get some calls in, but I'd like to welcome everybody anyway. We are live, it is Sunday. I don't even have the date. There's a lot of stuff going on in the studio today. We're getting ready for the new season, so there's special requirements for the videotape. Evidently, this is the 29th, April 29th, 2007. We are live. This is a public access call-in television program, which may not actually be a call-in show today. I'm your host, Matt Dillahunty. Joining me this week, Russell Glasser. We'll be Russell will be presenting some stuff on evolution here shortly, but I want to get the regular announcements out of the way. We're sponsored by the Atheist Community of Austin, a nonprofit educational organization promoting positive atheism and the separation of church and state. The ACA has weekly meetings every Sunday at Ventana del Sol on East Oltorf, just a couple blocks east of I-35. In addition to this program, the ACA also sponsors a bi-weekly internet audio podcast called The Nonprofits. That's Prophets. We'll be live this coming Saturday, May 5th. And I'll tell you more about that in a second because this coming week is going to be very busy and special stuff on both of the shows. In addition to this program and the nonprofits, the ACA also supports a number of social activities and outreach opportunities, including Atheist Happy Hour every Thursday at the Dog and Duck Pub. That begins at 7 o'clock. More information about all of our events and membership information and just anything you want to find out is at www.atheist-community.org. If you don't get through on the telephone lines today because they're probably broken, or if you didn't want to, you can always email tv@atheist-community.org. That goes to myself, all the co-hosts, and some of the people back working behind the scenes to make sure the show happens. Thanks for tuning in. Please bear with us. We apologize for any of the problems. This coming week's going to be very, very busy. The 3rd is the National Day of Reason, which coincides with the National Day of Prayer. The ACA will be involved down at the steps of down in front of the Capitol building to promote reason. There are other groups around the country who are also doing special events for the National Day of Reason. The Rational Response Squad is encouraging all free thinkers to go out and give blood and tissue so that we can actually help people far more than folding your hands and hitting your knees is ever going to do for anybody. In addition to all of the events that are going on, we also go to dinner after the program. This show's on until 6 o'clock, and around 6:30 or so, we'll be at Threadgills on Riverside. Any atheist or atheist-friendly person is welcome to attend, and that goes for almost all of our events, including the very special events that are coming up next weekend. On Saturday, May 5th, the Center for Inquiry Austin will be bringing author Vic Stinger to town to talk about his book. You can go to Center for Inquiry/Austin for more information on that. He'll be at Book People for a book signing in the morning on that Saturday. He'll be the special guest on the Nonprofits episode Saturday as well. There'll also be a lecture Saturday night, and then the Sunday he'll be here on this program, and I'm hoping we have everything fixed by then, because it'd be a shame not to be able to give you guys the opportunities to ask him questions. His book's called God, the Failed Hypothesis, and it goes through what types of gods are logically possible, what type of evidence there is for it, and let's take a look at reality, build scientific models, and see what's left. What is possible for people to actually believe in, and still maintain a consistent worldview that's rooted in reality and logic and evidence and reason. I probably have more announcements, but I'm going to hold off on all of them while we sort out some technical difficulties, and go ahead and let Russell start telling us about evolution.
Okay, but first I have a somewhat personal sad announcement to make, which is that as regular watchers will know, I've been in grad school for the last year and 4 months, and I'm entering the home stretch. I've got 8 months and 2 semesters left to go, and it's come to my attention that with an impending master's thesis coming up, I'm doing way too much. And that's why last week will have been my last episode on the nonprofits for quite a while. I'm going to continue doing this show once a month, but I'm taking a hiatus from the nonprofits, and ordinarily, I didn't want to spring this on you at the last minute, so ordinarily I would probably pull one or two more episodes, but it sounds like you don't need me that much for the Vic Stenger episode, and I haven't read the book anyway.
We've got the Vic Stinger episode covered.
Right.
You'll definitely be missed on future episodes, but we'll look forward to getting you back and getting Jeff D back.
And I'll miss being on future episodes, but I will be listening in every week, and I know that you'll come up with someone great to fill in. All right. Let's see, today is going to be the third in my ongoing series on evolution, where last month, 3 months ago, I talked about why atheists are interested in evolution, and we basically came to the conclusion that the reason that evolution and atheism seem so related is not because accepting evolution makes you an atheist, and not because being an atheist forces you to accept evolution, but because by and large, evolution is universally accepted as a scientific theory, and the only people who are seriously raising objections to it are a bunch of religious people, and religious people are what we love handling. So there was that, and then we skipped a month where I didn't talk about evolution, and then last month I talked about bad creationist arguments in an extra short show. And this month I was planning to talk about intelligent design, which is one of my favorite topics, but then Matt said, hey, you've been talking about creationists so much, why don't you actually talk about evolution? Well, there's a very good reason I wasn't planning, I hadn't thought about talking about evolution, which is, and here's my dirty little secret, I'm not that good at science. I'm really good at computer stuff, and I'm good at philosophy of science sort of stuff, but science really isn't my bag. I mean, my father is a physicist, and I started out as a physics major in school, but then I decided computers were more fun for me. But I have picked up a fair amount of evolution, and today we're going to be talking, leaving the creationists behind for a while, and talking about why evolution is such a well-accepted theory. At first I was a little worried that I wouldn't have much to talk about, but in fact, when I started reading and making a list of the things I did know, I found out that I'm going to have tons to say, and I guess that if the phones were going to be broken on any day, today's as good a day as any, so I can actually get through a lot of this stuff. So, let me first say a few words about the scientific method. First of all, as we like to repeat over and over again on this show when we talk about any science, there is no such thing as a proof in science. Everything is left open to a certain amount of disconfirmation should new evidence come in. We always know that our state of knowledge is not complete, and therefore anything that we say is pretty much a certainty in science is stuff that is really well confirmed, but should some incredibly unlikely new information come in, everything could potentially be overruled. It's not likely to happen. An example of that sort of thing happening would be that Newton's laws of motion were completely universally accepted as the foundation of physics, and then Einstein came along, introduced relativity. He didn't completely overthrow Newton's laws of relativity, as it turns out, but he did show that there are limits. I'm sorry, Newton's laws of motion, but Einstein did show that there are limits to. I mean, like when you're going really, really fast, or you're near something really, really heavy, they actually aren't true anymore. So, but Nevertheless, we didn't stop teaching Newton's laws of motion. We still teach that things fall and things are attracted sort of by gravitation and so on and so on. I would say that evolution is pretty much analogous to anything we understand as well as the laws of physics.
One of the things that we know about science is that it doesn't really do anything to explain the universe. What it does is it describes the universe and it builds models, and the models are considered viable and accepted so long as they don't become falsified and so long as they're continually useful.
Yes.
And so Newton's laws of motion are still useful within the scales where they have always been useful.
Right.
And Tim Sudo and some others who I've talked to in the past have brought up the example that we know the Earth isn't flat, and yet there's still, in the localized kind of paradigm, a flat Earth model works. We don't construct buildings based on, we're going to adjust for the curvature of the Earth, because locally, flat is good enough.
Exactly. And that's a good analogy to the Newton stuff. It does bring up the point, sort of, that evolution is basically built on a foundation of observations, whereas creationists seem to believe that evolution is something that some people made up because they didn't want to acknowledge that a God did it all. In fact, most of the people who laid the foundations for evolution up to a certain point were mostly believers in God, including Darwin earlier in his life. Because what science does is it just looks at what's out there and then makes descriptions of how things are observed to work. So one of the things that I'm going to repeat a few times today is the fact that there are multiple lines of evidence which all sort of match up and agree with each other and convey the overall impression that this thing that we think happened, common descent with modification, really did happen. And here are a bunch of different types of observation we can make which all match up to fit the theory. So, once again, here's the quick crash course in evolution. First of all, there's descent with modification, where if you're a human and you have kids, your kids are almost like you, almost like both parents, but not quite. Sometimes there are little changes. Now, as far as I know, this point is not controversial at all, even among creationists. So there's variation within a species, and there are also small mutations, which are little changes in the DNA. Now, this is going to be a tricky subject, and I'm not going to do it justice, but here are a few words about DNA. DNA is basically the building blocks of life. All life as we know it is composed of 4 different chemicals whose initials are A, C, T, and G, and one of them is adenine, and I don't remember the rest of them because I might have mentioned I'm not that good at science. What? No, I can't hear you. But A, C, T, and G is as good a representation as any, because the analogy that I'm going to make is an alphabet. All the books that are written in the English language are basically composed of combinations of the same 26 letters, and then of course there's punctuation, but you can do without punctuation, and really punctuation just raises the number of symbols to about 50 to 100. So there's a limited set of symbols that people recognize in the alphabet, and by combining those symbols in different ways, you can convey all the thoughts that have ever been written down in human history. Let's see. Well, okay, DNA is similar to that. Basically, and again, I don't think this is terribly controversial, a species is entirely, I would say, defined by their DNA. So, in the last decade or so, there's been this big project to decode the human genome, and you could theoretically, although it doesn't exist yet, you could come up with a machine that would just read in a whole bunch of letters, just combinations of these 4 letters, A, C, T, and G, and then it would like combine chemicals in various ways and create like, a person or a donkey or whatever. So when we say that things, that there is descent with modification, what we mean is that when you have a child, all the letters in your DNA are basically passed down as a combination between the mother and the father's DNA, and there are some minor changes from parent to child, which are mutations. Now, a common thing that creationists like to say, and I said we wouldn't be talking that much about creationists, but I just can't help myself. They have this question, which they seem to think is so clever, which is, can you present me with a single example of a mutation that is beneficial to an organism? Or, no, I'm sorry, that's not what I meant. Can you provide me with a single example of a mutation which creates new information? Because what they say is, yeah, there can be mutation, but it only ever destroys information. It never creates new information. In fact, this was famously posed to Richard Dawkins, who had believed that he was having a documentary filmed about him, and then they asked this question, and suddenly he realized, oh my God, I have a bunch of creationists in my house doing a hit piece on me, and he has about 10 seconds of uncomfortable science before he says, please get out of my house. And of course, they later spliced in this 10 seconds to make it look like actually Richard Dawkins can't answer the question, which is silly because it's really a very easy question when it comes to answering it in terms of DNA. So again, that question is, can you come up with an example of a mutation which creates new information in a gene? Well, imagine a sequence of letters. We'll make it really simple. We'll say AC. And then we'll say that a mutation comes along which doubles one of the letters. So you've got ACC. So you've got, where you used to have 2 letters, you now have 3. And this isn't unlikely because actually duplication is a very easy thing to do within genetic instructions. So you've got ACC, and then a second mutation comes along and changes the last C to a T. So now you've got ACT. So you used to have 2 letters, and now you have one entirely different letter that's been introduced, and that's what you call new information.
It's really, the DNA itself has this method for self-replication,
right?
And it isn't foolproof. Mistakes can be made.
Yes.
And I've seen examples and other explanations of this where, for example, when you are combining the DNA from 2 parents, which happens during sexual reproduction, on occasion, one will get misaligned. So where they would go together like this, it ends up skipping and coming up, and now you've got an extra set of information. In the case where they're trying to demonstrate common ancestry, one of the things that they talk about is the number of chromosomes that exist in humans as compared to the rest of the great apes, and we have fewer. We have 23 pairs. And so obviously, if evolution is true, then we need to come up with an explanation for that. Either all of the other great apes have managed to gain an extra set of chromosomes by doubling, or we've lost a pair. And it turns out that we have in fact lost a pair, and that what happened was two chromosomes fused during coupling, and it turns out to be chromosome 2 in humans, which is, I don't know why this isn't, all over every, well, I know why it's not all over every creationist site, but it should be all over every evolution site. We talked before about Francis Collins from the head of the Human Genome Project,
right,
who is an evangelical, who has stated clearly that common descent is as much a fact as anything, and that the DNA evidence alone is enough to prove it. You don't have to rely on a single fossil.
Right.
So,
one of the ways that creationists like to present evolution as a wrong or controversial theory is to highlight those areas where the science is still in flux. And that's pretty funny because creationists are all over the place. with evolution, you've got 99% of all biologists, as I've said in previous months, accept that common descent happened, and it's so strongly understood that you've even got these nouveau creationists like Francis Collins still saying yes, descent from a common ancestor is a fact, and you've got someone like Michael Behe, who is the champion of intelligent design, also saying yes, common descent is a fact. And so there's lots and lots of agreement among scientists, and then there's disagreement among the outliers, whereas between different groups of creationists, you've got some people saying, the Earth is the real scientific answer of billions of years old, and then you've got some groups saying it's 6,000 years old, and then you've got some people just making up this completely out there theory like, oh yeah, the way you explain the Great Flood, the way fossils formed is that the Great Flood suddenly froze a bunch of animals in the ground. And coming up with all these crazy theories which have nothing at all to do with science, have never had any kind of papers published on them, and they're pretty much all over the place. So descent with modification, of course, happens. That's a very simple claim to make, and the next claim that is generally made is basically that when a mutation happens, sometimes the mutation is harmful. Most of the time, the mutation has pretty much no effect, and I'll talk about an example of that a little later. And then occasionally, the mutation is actually beneficial to the species, and the ones that are beneficial tend to spread to the rest of the population because the animals that don't have that particular mutation are at a competitive disadvantage with the other ones, and so the ones that do have it live longer, have more children, and crowd out the rest of them until everybody has it and it's no longer a mutation but just a part of the species.
There's a phrase that you use which might actually cause some problems for some people who aren't familiar with it, and that is that the beneficial mutation spreads to the rest of the species.
Yeah.
Russell's talking about those are the ones who are most likely to reproduce while the others die off.
Right, it doesn't spread like a virus.
Yeah,
it doesn't spread like a virus in jumping to different animals that are already living.
Right.
It just means that when the children are born, they're more likely to have that mutation. Thanks for correcting me on that. And of course, something that happens every once in a while is something we call speciation, which means you've got two different groups which are mutating in different directions. This tends not to happen if they are in a group together because they can interbreed with each other and sort of cancel out the mutations. But when you separate a group, when you separate two groups of the same species, like geographically, like let's say one of them gets lost in the woods or something, the group that's in the woods tends to mutate in a different direction from the group that's not in the woods. And then eventually, if those two groups should ever meet again, they often find that they have mutated so far apart that they no longer can breed with each other. And when that happens, they are referred to as a different species. Species just means that two organisms that are a different species, it just means that they can't breed with each other. And of course, this happens all the time, and I'll get to that later. It's happened in the laboratory, for example. And the final thing that indicates that evolution happens on a large scale is that over time, these small changes add up and lead to very, very big changes, which you would think isn't a controversial claim. It's like saying if you take one and then you add one and then you add one and then you add one and you keep doing it for a very, very long time, then eventually you'll get to, 9 quadrillion or something like that. I mean, as long as you keep doing it long enough, they add up. And the fact that the fact that we have all these very complex very complex working parts, like the eye, for example, or all these complicated microbiological machines that Behe is always talking about. There are evolutionary pathways that are based on very, very small changes, and each change provides a very tiny benefit to the organism that is changing. And so over time, these parts are generated. And I'll get to that later too. Any comments?
No, I'm with you.
Okay. All right. Still going. All right. First of all, microevolution, or what the creationists like to call microevolution. Now,
this is a distinction that is really kind of pointless, and they've managed to actually get some scientists, some respectable scientists who actually understand evolution to use this same terminology, and it really starts to bug me.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. Of course, microevolution is a fact, so I shouldn't even be spending any time on this because it's even granted by creationists. But just to make clear what they would refer to as microevolution, I'm going to provide a famous example, which is the peppered moth. Now, the peppered moth is a kind of moth that lives near England. And the peppered moth comes in several shades. There are lighter colored moths that are nearly white, and there are darker colored moths that are nearly black, and there are various shades in between. And these moths, just like most moths, are especially tasty to a lot of birds. And the birds would like to go and eat these moths, but they can't get a good meal if they can't see the moths. So one of the tricks that the moths have developed over a long time is that they like to sit very, very still on backgrounds where they cannot be seen, and if they don't move too much, then the bird will not notice them and will not eat them. Now, in a famous series of experiments, I think in the 60s, it was discovered that while before the Industrial Revolution, most of the moths had been light-colored, and coincidentally, all the trees around the area also happened to be light-colored, so the moths could sit on these light trees and not be seen. As the Industrial Revolution went on, there was a lot of soot in the air. The trees became darker and darker. And as that happened, the moths became darker. Not because the moths were covered with soot, because they were moving around.
The environment had changed.
Right.
And now the darker ones were more likely to survive.
Exactly, because the birds found it easier to eat light moths sitting on top of dark trees, and so over time, the population of moths changed and became more and more dark. Now, Jonathan Wells, who is one of the clowns working at the Discovery Institute, has made a big deal about this experiment, and one of the most common things you hear about this experiment is, but there were already light and dark moths, and nothing new was created, which is dumb, because that's not the point of that. The point is that it's an illustration of variable survival, which is one of the aspects of evolution, but not the aspect of basically generating new information, which I already explained does happen. Now, of course, creationists refer to microevolution as anything which has been observed or has been explained, and then as you get onto larger and larger scales, things become harder to observe directly because they happen at billions of years. So any time that we haven't directly observed something, creationists simply draw a dividing line and then say, oh, we haven't observed it because, macroevolution isn't real. And then, of course, they make up this ridiculous unscientific word called kinds to get around the fact that speciation really does happen, which is my next point.
Yeah, speciation is something that actually has been observed. It's a fact. The biggest reason that some people have a really hard time grasping a lot of this.
Yeah.
And it's understandable because we're talking about things that occur over the span of billions of years, hundreds of millions of years. You know, billions was a slight exaggeration when we're talking about some of the species and stuff, but
Right, most
over
of
many
them.
millions of years, when our lifespan is, you know, if you're lucky, you might hit 100. We're very bad at grasping things that occur outside of that time span. We have a pretty good grasp on how long a second is and how long a minute is, and we can do okay with days and weeks and months. But when we start talking about decades, things get a little fuzzier. When we start talking about centuries, fuzzier still. And then when we talk about millennia and millions of years, we lose our ability to really understand how much things can change. And I read, I think it was yesterday, that there may actually be only, 10,000 generations between modern humans and the last common ancestor with the other great apes, I think. But don't quote me.
Yeah, that's possible. 10,000 generations would be...
Or maybe it was 1,000 generations. I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know. Maybe it's more than that.
Yeah, I don't want to toss out numbers and get them wrong. We're here, you know, one of the reasons we're talking about evolution is because it comes up a lot. People are concerned about, you know, where did I come from? Where am I going? What's going to happen after I die? And one of those questions is, how do you explain the wild diversity of life?
Right.
And evolution is the current best explanation. And I say that, when I say current best, I'm not hedging bets. Evolution is a fact, an observed fact. The common descent is
Right.
now
I mean,
so well supported that...
The term evolution is a blanket term, but when we say evolution is a fact, we mean we have observed all these things like mutation, change in allele frequency over time, which is the technical definition of evolution, and speciation. And then, you know, through the fossil record and other methods, we're able to recognize large changes over long periods. But I'll get to that in a minute.
You know, and we build up, and all of the evidence points to common descent, speciation, that there are these, people mistakenly refer to them as transitional forms. Really, everything is always a transitional form. We're always in transition to something else.
There are no static forms. So, talking about speciation, I mean, you know, this shouldn't even be controversial either. In fact, almost nothing I talk about should really be controversial, and yet it is. But for some reason, creationists who, even though they have to go through all these backbends and twists and turns to avoid saying evolution, and will make up these words like kinds to get around the fact that they know that speciation has happened, they'll still argue about whether speciation has happened. So first of all, I would point out that speciation has been observed in the laboratory, and obviously it's easier to speciate two things when they have a very short life cycle. I mean, you know, if you have if you have a species that's able to mature and have more children in an hour, it's obviously easier to test with than experimenting on people who, you know, take 12 years in the most optimistic case, and usually more like 21.
Which is why they work with fruit flies that
Right.
reproduce quickly.
Fruit
and it's
flies
also,
have been speciated. They've actually created new species in laboratories.
And it's clear to biologists, especially those working in medical fields, but it's not quite so clear to other people because we don't often look at. We realize that bacteria and viruses and such are living things, but it doesn't. They're in the very, very small, and much like I was talking about with time spans, the same is true for the very, very small and the very, very large. They're so far outside of our view that we just have difficulty grasping them. But viruses are one of the best examples of evolution in progress because they reproduce so rapidly. They'll get into cells and produce hundreds or millions of offspring, etc. And they're going to vary. They're not so worried about making sure that they're copied correctly, that the DNA is copied correctly, as it is that we're copying it many, many, many times.
Right.
And because of that, we're actually, while I'm not saying don't get vaccinated, please get vaccinated, but we are, in some cases, vaccinating ourselves to death and being overly clean about things because we're killing off these weaker strains as they mutate and into new strains that we can't necessarily treat with our current medicines. But in the meantime, we're also making our own immune system less capable of dealing with it.
Yeah.
And all of this is an example of evolution at a rapid scale. I mean, there have been examples of species across a cornfield.
For example, the AIDS virus has only existed for much less than a century. And while there are these nutty conspiracy theories floating around out there that it was created in a government lab, and please don't call me and explain to me why you know that's true. While there are those theories floating out there, AIDS is an example of a virus that has just recently come into existence, and this happens a lot. It's not that unusual. Okay, so speciation has been observed in the laboratory, and another way that we know that speciation happens is through some cool little happenstances, like the ones that we call ring species. Now, this is really kind of interesting. An example of a ring species is the salamander Ensantina, which happens to live in sort of a loop that goes around the Central Valley of California. Now, for some reason that I didn't research carefully, but these salamanders all live around the valley. They don't live in the valley, and as you would expect to happen with a population that is spread out apart over a long ways, the farther apart you go, the more things sort of change from each other, so that the lizards, the salamanders drift apart genetically. So you've got a group of lizards that's has one set of DNA, and then if you go a couple of miles in one direction, you find that most of the lizards over a couple of miles away breed with each other and not with those other lizards. So there's a little bit of genetic drift, and then you keep moving and you keep going around the valley, and there's more and more drift as you go around, and then you get to a certain point where actually there's two species of salamanders living together. And they can't breed with each other because they are actually the result of a whole lot of genetic drift that has wandered all the way around this valley in California until they got all the way back to the beginning again, and then there was an entirely new species, which is, if you will, very similar to the group of salamanders on the left, but completely different from the group of salamanders on the right. So this is another great way that we observe speciation. Now, still, the creationists refer to this as microevolution and come up with all sorts of objections about the fossil record, which is actually a very, very good way that we recognize big changes over time. We know that the small changes happen. We know that 1 and 1 and 1 and 1 and 1 eventually makes a trillion if you keep adding enough. And what the fossil record does for us is basically very rarely an animal, a species. I don't want to be animalist and exclude plants, but very rarely some species, some particular member of a species will fossilize and leave sort of a record, and then we have fossil bones and we can reconstruct skeletons. And one of the things, and over time, creationists keep saying that there aren't any transitional forms, but over time the changes add up, and we can actually see sort of little snapshots in the evolution of an animal, like the horse, for example. Now, the horse is one of the best documented sequences of fossils, and I've got a picture of it, which the lights are way too bright, so there's no way you're going to be able to see these. Well, that's too bad, but basically I went to Wikipedia, and by the way, I haven't plugged this bunch of links that's somewhere in the presentation today. So if any producers are paying attention, could you please put those links up now? Basically, this is from the Wikipedia page on the evolution of the horse. So just go to Wikipedia and search for horse evolution. There it is. It's the third link down. Okay, the first one, the first link here is the page that I started on, which is at talkorigins.org. It's the FAQ for Common Descent, Evidence for Macroevolution. talkorigins.org/FAQ, FAQ/ComDesc, COMDESC. Then we've got the observed instances of speciation down below, which due to space restrictions, you'll just have to Google for yourself. I'm sorry. But search for observed instances of speciation, and I know you'll come up with the Talk Origins page. And then we have this nice sequence of pictures showing horse evolution, which is based on a whole bunch of really well-kept fossils that have happened over time. And over time, what we see is we've got this tiny little, cute little horse, which is 0.4 meters long, and I'm not real good at that feet to meters conversion, but it's like a medium-sized dog, I guess. I hope that's right. It's called the Hyrocotherium.
Half a meter? It's about the size of a cat.
Okay, a little cat-sized horse. And there are actually, I think, fairly complete skeletons of that horse, and then a horse that's a little bit bigger than a cat, and then a horse that's a little bit bigger than that, and keeps going until you got 1.6 meters, which is how big horses are today, or how tall they are today. Let's see. So 0.4 would be 1/4 the size of a modern horse. That seems bigger than a cat to me.
They're talking about shoulder height, I'm pretty sure.
Okay. Well, anyway, and also another interesting thing that happens about these with these horses is that the Hyrocotherium has five toes. Okay, one's really short. It's kind of analogous to our thumb because horses and people came from a common ancestor. Right. And over time, you can actually see some of the toes getting shorter and fused together. And eventually, you get the single hoof like the horse has today. And then the horses still have sort of little fingers, but they're very short and they're fused to the main hoof and they're pulled way up high. So that's one example of how the fossil record has helped us understand what macroevolution basically is. And I've asked a creationist in the past, what do you make of these horses? Are these two is the modern horse the same kind as the cute little cat-sized horse that existed a long time ago? And I believe he declined to answer at the time.
Yeah, one of the things that happens, a lot of times you'll line up these transitional forms, and say, okay, here's a very early ancestor of the horse, and here's a horse, and here's all these in between that we found. And the creationists who say that there's no transitional fossils can look at that and just draw an arbitrary line. They did the same thing with human ancestors. You start with a modern human skull and line up this procession of, let's say, 100 skulls back to the oldest ones that we have. And a creationist will walk in and just draw a line and say everything on this side is an ape and everything on this side is a human. Exactly. The problem is that if you ask 10 creationists, line is in...
You're stealing that.
Am I stealing your stuff? I won't steal it. But
yeah, no, it's okay.
You can do it. We get to it.
Yeah, well, actually, it turns out that another of the best lines of fossils we have actually happens to be human evolution, which you wouldn't think to hear creationists talk. But we have this whole sequence of intermediate forms between apes and humans, some of which. And when a creationist looks at these, they, of course, are in a creationist mindset where there are apes and there are humans, and they don't transition between each other. And so...
Let me interrupt and pause for just a second. For those of you who may have been tuned in late or missed the beginning of the show, I want to remind everybody, first of all, we will be going to Threadgills after the show. The show's over at 6 o'clock. We'll be down there around 6:30 or so. Any atheist or atheist-friendly person is welcome to attend. You can come down and talk to us. Anybody who had comments about today's show and isn't able to get through on the telephones because They seem to be broken. We're not getting anything on line 1. Line 2's come on and off a couple different times, so feel free to try and call in. They'll have the number up on the screen. If you get through, great. If you don't, we apologize. We'll try and have everything fixed up. Definitely want everything fixed up for next week when Vic Stinger will be down here as our guest. But if you've been trying to call in and you're not getting through, it's not because we want to sit here and ramble and ignore you. Russell's got the good stuff to talk about, and the phones aren't working, so we're taking advantage of it. So just want to let everybody know in case they tuned in late.
Yeah. There's someone on the phone now, but we don't know his name yet. So.
We don't know if it's working.
Right. So anyway, as I was saying, so when a creationist sees a fossil that is presented as a transitional fossil, their first impulse is to say, "Oh, that's definitely a human. There's no transition there," or "Oh, that's definitely an ape. There's no transition there." Or they'll come up with something like, "Oh, well, that's a human, but it was probably retarded," or something like that. or this is a child, or an unusually large human, or
somebody they suffered from some deformity, or
right.
You know.
They come up with something. The problem is, as Matt was about to say a minute ago, if you line up this sequence, if you take all this sequence of fossils and you poll a bunch of different creationists, and this has got to be my favorite page on talkorigins.org, the hominid skull fossils. If you take a bunch of these skulls and present them to a bunch of different creationists, they'll all say, yeah, that's definitely a human, or yeah, that's definitely an ape, but they don't agree with each other. And the great thing is that as you get closer to what scientists classify as the middle, you can see a perfect relation with how much the creationists disagree with each other. So I have here a page which, again, you can't see, unfortunately, because of the lighting in here. But it's a sequence of fossil skulls printed off of talk.origins, and then it's tabulated with what different creationists said about them. And you can see, you can go down the column and see ape, 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 human, human, and then ape, 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 human, 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 and then ape, ape, human, 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 human. And it matches perfectly with the
and there's
sequence
one where they
of
pause
fossils.
where they've got humans on both sides of the ape.
Well, yeah,
Human,
that's
human,
right.
ape, human, human.
Right. So they're not, not completely, but, and also in this table are opinions taken actually from different creationists at different times. So in fact, you've got a couple of fossils where, for instance, this creationist Dwayne Gish used to believe that both of these fossils were definitely apes, and then later he changed his mind and said, no, they're definitely humans. And you've got another creationist with the same two fossils who used to say they're humans and now says they're apes.
Yeah. Let's. This one's supposedly working. We're going to try real quick and try one call and see if the phones are working. We got Cliff. How you doing?
Hey, pretty good.
Hi.
Yeah, I got a question. Is evolution, does that apply to people? I mean, if so, can you explain where we exactly come from?
Evolution applies to all living things. I mean,
Right.
So at one time, we kind of started out as possibly like ape form, right?
Ape-like, yes.
Okay, I agree to that. And I also agree that that Adam and Eve wasn't the first two people on Earth. Do y'all...
I'm not even convinced they exist, so sure, I'll buy that.
There is a concept called mitochondrial Eve, which we've talked about in the past, which is basically scientific shorthand for the most recent mitochondrial ancestor of all humans. But there were a lot of other organisms that were exactly like mitochondrial Eve at the time, so you're right.
Okay, so when Cain was kicked out of the Garden of Eden... so
that didn't happen.
So Adam and Eve is more or less a figure of speech. It's not really a person or people, correct?
When you come to... Anytime you hear scientists talking in a scientific paper about and using the words Adam and Eve, they're just taking advantage of the fact that people have heard of the Adam and Eve in the Bible, and it's figurative.
Okay. Yeah, a Christian friend of mine said the world started, or man was created back then, and I believe that the Earth is like, what, 400 million years old or something like that.
The Earth's
Some
about
of them
four
say
and a half
6,000,
billion,
but yeah,
4.5 billion?
billion.
yeah.
Wow, I guess he's way off then.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank y'all.
Thanks a lot, Clint.
Okay, thanks for calling.
He's off by several orders of magnitude.
3, exactly. Okay.
We'll get back to more calls. They're still working
Yeah,
on
I'm
the phone
torn
system.
between taking more calls because I know that I don't have quite enough to fill out the full hour and a half, but I do have a lot.
Well, they're saying to take this call real
Do
quick.
take David, okay?
So we got David. How you doing?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, thank God. No offense.
Not taking.
I've called in to you guys a couple of times. I'm always running off to work when I call because
Yeah.
you guys come on right before I work, darn it.
Well,
Sorry.
I just wanted to point out a couple of things, and then I have to run, and you guys just comment on it again.
Okie-doke.
I just wanted to point out that when we talk about science, especially when we're talking about the findings and the different stratas and everything, it is not just creationists that don't agree with one another. When you get down to the journals and papers and everything, a great deal of the paleontologists of evolutions and things don't agree either with one another, especially on the smaller and finer points. And very often, their papers are written just to argue with one another.
right.
That's
And
really
I
how
just I wanted to
science
point
works.
that out and show that it's not all on one side that there's disagreements.
There's a
There's
difference in
disagreements everywhere.
There's a difference in the type of disagreement, though, and the scope of the disagreement.
Well, that may be. One more thing to add in that I don't know if you guys know or not, because I've actually spent a little time researching this lately. When we're talking about the hominids, did you know that the ones that they actually are able to fit to different things like Cro-Magnon or to the Ferences or all of the different hominid transitionals, it is actually a very small amount of their finds.
Sometimes.
If you can actually get the journal from, it's the London Museum of History, I believe it's called, and there are actually 8,000 finds, and they only tell us about the few that they can actually make to look like a Cro-Magnon or a Ferences or an Africanus or some of those, but they remain totally silent on all those finds that don't
That's called
look
good,
like an intermediate. I got to go. Please comment on that. I love you guys. I wish I could go to dinner with y'all, but I have to work.
All right, thanks, David.
Bye-bye.
That's actually called good science.
Right.
You don't come out and talk about the things that you haven't actually properly classified yet. That's just good science. It's not like the phrase that you actually used was they'd pull out the ones that they can make look like a Cro-Magnon. And that implies that, they're just putting this stuff together and fitting it to fit a preconceived notion, and that's not the case. Sure, there's plenty of fossils and bits of bone that we may never know what they came from. I mean, we can try. You don't always have workable DNA. You don't always have good examples. They may be from, there may be people with deformities and stuff that just aren't going to fit a pattern. But to not come out and say, to make sure that you're not giving out the information that you're talking about is just good science. You don't come out and say, and we got a truckload of this stuff in the back, but we don't know where it goes. I mean, we know that's the case, but you don't bother talking about that because it doesn't push anything forward. And it also, the existence of that stuff doesn't in any way discredit the information that's actually provided by the science. The fact that they may have 10,000 bones that are undefined make no difference when we're talking about whether or not this particular skeleton here is accurate and whole and representative of transitional
like these
fossil.
complete skulls that we
Right.
have, of course, that creationists never agree on what they are. So let me get into my next topic, which is genetics, and I'm back to DNA again. In biology class, whether you have a competent professor or a creationist professor, you generally learn something which is known as the scientific classification of animals. Like, for instance, we all have heard that humans are technically called Homo sapiens, and wolves are called Canis lupus, and so on. And what classification is actually the tail end of a much longer classification. So when we say that a wolf, for example, is a Canis lupus, what we mean is it's in the lupus subspecies of the Canis species. I hope I'm getting that right. Or maybe it's the lupus species of the Canis family, or something like that. But it keeps going back and back. So before the Canis family, it goes up to the mammal it goes up to the mammal group, and then the vertebrate group, and then so on, and eventually the entire animal kingdom. And the scientific classification, of course, isn't controversial, and it wasn't invented by Darwinists with an agenda. In fact, it was invented by Carl Linnaeus in around 1727, which is a good 140 years before Darwin came up with the idea of evolution. And so we've got this scientific classification which basically organizes all of life into this sort of branching tree, not of descent, because they didn't have that idea at the time, but of similarity. So if you take any two species, you can actually connect them up based on their similarity. And as I say, this was around way before Darwin. And then when Darwin came along, it explained a lot about why animals, why all the different species could be classified this way. It was basically because the apparent similarity between them is actually an indication of how far apart their ancestors were. So this was an interesting little fact, but it really got interesting with the discovery of DNA, because for the first time people were able to actually see precisely how related things were based on how much their DNA matched up. Of course, for all the apparent similarities between different humans living on Earth, over 99% of their DNA is exactly the same. And that little, much less than 1%, determines particular things about you, like the way your face looks and the way your voice sounds and all the things that make you specifically you. So clearly all humans have a common ancestor, but another thing that was learned about DNA is that, for instance, humans and chimpanzees have about 96% of their DNA exactly identical to chimpanzees. In fact, there was just a story about this in National Geographic 2 years ago, which raised the number to 96. It says, scientists have sequenced the genome of the chimpanzee and found that humans are 96% similar to the great ape species. Darwin wasn't just provocative in saying that we descend from apes. He didn't go far enough, said Franz de Waal, a primate scientist at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. We are apes in every way, from our long arms and tailless bodies to our habits and temperament. So what's really interesting is that you take the classification which already existed and had been worked on since the time of Linnaeus, and you discover that people creating these hierarchies based just on the appearance of different plant and animal species, actually, when they started sequencing DNA and comparing the different DNA sequences of different species, they found out that the level of DNA matching almost exactly matched the classification that already existed, thanks to Linnaeus.
Although we've stopped, actually, scientists are no longer using that old, order, family, genus.
Yeah, right.
They're using new classification systems that are better.
Of course.
We did find out some interesting stuff. Like, for example, the elephant's nearest living relative is this really small weevil type thing.
Yeah.
Which, you wouldn't get if you were using the looks similar kind of classification system.
Yeah.
So, and that's an example of we've gained new knowledge, new information, and science has changed what it's saying about something. You know, the progress doesn't stop. There's no point at which the truth is written and it stays that way forever, unlike most every religion.
Right. But our perception of what the truth is actually becomes more and more refined over time because we keep the good ideas and we throw out the bad ideas. In fact, you could almost say it's just like evolution. Let's see. Okay, now I'm talking more about macroevolution, and I want to talk about how we can also deduce the evolutionary history of these so-called complex machines based on the things that already exist today. I mean, of course, there are species which represent a transitional form on the way to generating our species, humans, and other modern species. And we can learn things from those fossils, but another really good way to learn about evolutionary pathways is to actually go out into the world and look at the different species that exist today and see how closely, based on, we know how closely related they are, and we can actually see intermediate stages of things that we're trying to figure out how they came to be. Like, for instance, there's the favorite misquote by the creationists of the eye. Darwin famously said in The Origin of Species that it seems absurd to think that something as complex as the eye could possibly have evolved in small stages. And
that's where they stop.
Right, that's where they stop, or they put a ... there, where in fact there is no ... in the book. He goes on to say, but actually, there are lots of ways that it could have happened, and here's how. Of course, as as the science has improved and our ability to test things has improved, we've learned more and more things about how the eye works. And if you're really interested, and you should go and pick up a book by Richard Dawkins called Climbing Mount Improbable, where he explains a very good complete pathway from basically a cluster of light-sensitive cells all the way up to our really complicated eye with the lens and the cornea and the retina and all these different parts that work together so well.
And that raises a really interesting point. One of the most interesting things about evolutionary theory is this idea of convergent evolution, where two different, independently, you can have two different species come up with the same thing. It happens all over the place. Eyes are a really good example of it. And we get a number of different varieties of eyes because they evolved under different conditions in different species. But we do get some similarities. Why? Because we live in an environment that is similar. One of the things you'll find is that at the North and South Poles, you have fish who can survive in the extremely cold temperatures, and that's because they have these proteins that prevent their blood from freezing. What you find, though, is that the proteins of the fish at the South Pole and the proteins of the fish at the North Pole are completely different. They're not just different varieties of the same thing where they all had this protein and they split and it changed and altered over time. These are two different species who have evolved two completely different proteins. And if your idea is that there's a God who created everything the way it is, please explain that. Why would he go to all the trouble of creating two completely different proteins when either one of them would do the job for both sets of fish? Why, we talk about where did life come from and is there a creator and everything else. One of the things that struck me, during my period of time of transitioning from Christianity towards atheism, was this notion that as we learn more and more about the world we live in, as our understanding increases, as science continues to build models that function and tell us more about the world we live in, where do we stick God? And how does that relate to the sort of God that at one time I believed in, and then perhaps many of you believe in? And one of the things I came to the conclusion is that this kind of makes God out to be a liar. He created the entire universe and specifically went out of his way to make it look like he didn't do it. He gave us every indication that it all occurred naturally, right down to creating independent proteins when one would have done, to creating this wide diversity of life and putting it in places where we're never going to see it. There's life at the bottom of the ocean living around, sulfuric acid steam vents that we're just now finding from deep probes and stuff. But all of that's, nothing that matters to us. We're not if we're actually God's special creation, why the waste? Oh, and why put it all on one little ball, circling one other little ball, in a group of millions and billions of them, in a much vaster space? What a colossal waste! It reminds me of Monty Python.
Carl Sagan put in the mouth of his character in Contact, it seems like a huge waste of space if we're the only ones here.
Yeah. And watching Monty Python, I watched Monty Python and the Holy Grail last night, actually, and there's the part where they get to the enchanter Tim.
Oh, yes.
Who's got so much power that he's just sitting there launching, fire bolts at things all over the place. That's kind of the way I picture the traditional idea of a god, that I'm just so powerful, I'm going to create 50 billion planets when I'm only worried about this one right here. It's silly.
Yeah. Now, getting back on topic with the eye, you might ask, how would someone like Richard Dawkins know that the eye evolved in these particular stages and not these other ways? And the answer is, he doesn't have to guess. All he has to do is look at the species that already exist. And as you go farther and farther from our species, up that Linnaean classification tree, where you can see how closely related things are, you can actually see in different species living today different forms of the eye, which actually function as an eye, just not as good a one. And of course, there are other species that actually have better eyes than we do, like squids, for example. So another way that we are able to understand the evolutionary pathways of existing structures is that we just look elsewhere in the animal kingdom. It's really that easy.
You talked about animals with eyes that are better than ours.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things that we need to recognize is that there's a lot of different definitions for better, or ways that it could be better. There are animals whose eyesight is keener than ours, that can pick up smaller objects at greater distances. There are animals who have clear eyelids over their eyes, which help protect them. Ours are pretty vulnerable, but it would be nice to have eyelids that you could see through, so that you could maybe water your eyes and still be able to see clearly. There's all kinds of different ways of something being better. Animals that are faster than us. We're not the ultimate anything.
Right.
Except thinker. I think we're probably the ultimate thinker on this ball.
Well, there is a beautiful speech in Inherit the Wind, which I had memorized at one time, but I don't anymore. But the attorney who is supposed to be the historical figure, Clarence Darrow, his name in the movie is Henry Drummond, he goes up and he's arguing with the opposing creationist lawyer. And he says, why do you deny us the one power that we have over all the other animals, the power to think? Because, we're not the fastest, we're not the strongest, we're not, even the simple sponge is more prolific than we are. All we have is our ability to think. And we tend to lose sight of that in our sort of speciesist view when we imagine that evolution says that we're the top of an evolutionary chain, where there's this, that incredibly misleading picture that everybody's seen, where you've got a small monkey and then it grows up into a bigger and bigger ape, and then you wind up as the noble human, and the human is the end of evolution. When in fact there are still monkeys today, and monkeys are just as good at being monkeys as humans are at being humans. They're the end of an incredibly successful sequence of evolution. And whenever I hear someone like a caller we had last week, I'm sorry to say, who our caller said something like, "Wow, how can you believe in evolution? That says that a fish turned into a cow, turned into a monkey, turned into a human," which of course didn't happen. It's ridiculous because fish are good at being fish, cows are good at being cows. The fish and the cows also came down from an extremely long and complicated procedure of evolution. And also fish and cows are a completely different branch from us. Should we take one caller before I get to my last topic?
Yeah, we can do that. Now we've got, right now I think we're down to one phone line.
We should say, if you've been trying to call in and you didn't manage, it's because our phones are kind of hinky today, and so, they've been kind of broken. Again, if you want to talk to us, you can always email us or come to Threadgills after the show.
Yeah, we're down to one partially working phone line, I think.
Yeah.
I hope.
Didn't we take one on line 3 before? Oh.
Yeah.
Is this Karpal?
This is Karpal.
Hi.
How you doing?
Good, how you doing?
Fine.
Fine. You are too
You have a
fine.
question?
Hold up, wait a
Hello?
second. My phone is not...
Okay.
Okay.
I'll clear that one line.
that
for
was so worth
somebody
it.
else.
We'll be charitable and assume that it was our screwed up phone line that dropped him. All right. If you take just 1 point away from this today, I hope that it's this. A lot of callers call in and think that evolution is this big conspiracy that was created to justify atheism. It was built around a need to explain things without invoking a god, and that's why evolution is basically a product of the godless. Whereas what happened in reality was that they looked at all these things that were really happening in the world, all these different things like ring species and the way that things seem to be, the way that all living things seem to be organized in a hierarchy of similarity, the way they would have observed that DNA all fit together this way, even though they didn't know about DNA yet. All these things, as I say, that were actually happening, and they thought, what is it that could explain exactly why things look the way they do? Of course, Darwin was the first guy to realize what was going on and come up with this overarching theory of evolution, which has become the cornerstone of modern biology. But the idea was already in the air at that point. There were already some failed efforts to come up with something similar to the theory of evolution, which turned out to be wrong, but pretty close. And the reason there were so many of these theories floating around was not because people were trying to deny God, but they were looking at all these real issues in the world and trying to figure out how to explain them. It's only much, much later that we as atheists have come along and said, actually, this theory of evolution really does explain so much based on observations that it's no longer really necessary to insert a God. But even if you aren't an atheist and you never want to be an atheist, you should look into the science of why evolution is as well accepted as it is. And I'm going to throw out one last curveball to wrap this up that I just heard a couple of weeks ago from an interview where P.Z. Myers was talking to Reginald Finley, the infidel guy, on his audio show. And it was cool because it was something I had never heard before. Now, this has to do with vestigial organs. Features that we have which have turned out to be actually kind of useless. And P.Z. Myers was talking about vitamin C. Now, as you know, it's very important to humans to get a steady diet of vitamin C. Sailors who go for months at sea, who used to go out for a long time, used to get this horrible disease called scurvy, and they didn't realize for a while that what was happening was that they were lacking the vitamin C that was found in a land-bound diet, which included a lot of fruits. So, it became standard practice for long ocean voyages to bring a lot of citrus fruits on board, and that's actually why British sailors were eventually were called limeys as slang. But what I'm saying is, if you don't get enough vitamin C, it's a very bad thing. Now, what's interesting is most mammals create their own vitamin C. They synthesize it out of other elements that they eat, and they don't need to have extra fruit in their diet. Cats and dogs don't eat fruit, and they don't get scurvy because they synthesize their own DNA. Now, there's a gene that's...
vitamin C.
What?
You mean vitamin C.
Vitamin C. What did I say?
You said they synthesize their own DNA.
Okay, I don't know where that came from.
They're advancing quickly.
Yeah. Okay, they synthesize their own vitamin C. Now, we can actually identify the particular gene that creates this vitamin C. In fact, we've been able to identify it so carefully that we can create like mice that are incapable of producing their own vitamin C. So that mechanism is actually very well understood. Now, the interesting thing is, we have that gene. We have the gene that synthesizes vitamin C. It's broken. There is a very obvious bunch of junk code right in the middle of our DNA where that vitamin C synthesizer would have been. And as a result, that gene is useless. If you take out that gene, you get absolutely no deficiencies. I mean, basically, this is what they mean by junk DNA. You've got a bunch of DNA that does something in other animals, but because of the way it's broken, it doesn't do what it's supposed to, and it's not used for any other purpose. Now, here's the really interesting thing. Our closest relatives, apes, gorillas, and chimpanzee, they have the error too. They have, in fact, the exact same copy of that junk code, which doesn't do anything for us, but does synthesize vitamin C in other mammals. And we can identify the exact point in time where a mutation happened, and probably the mutation was basically neutral at the time because there was a lot of easy ways to get vitamin C in your diet at that time anyway. And so, like the question that Matt was asking earlier, if there's a God, if a God was designing humans and chimps specifically, why did he go to the trouble to make this precise segment of junk code, or to take some code that works perfectly well in other animals and deliberately screw it up in the same way among a bunch of species that, according to creationists, aren't related? Next month, my favorite topic, intelligent design.
Good, because there's
And now
lots of
we're
stuff
going to
we
callers.
can... Yeah, we can... I read some interesting stuff about intelligent design the other day, especially about unintelligent design. Particularly, there'll be some interesting... an interesting look at the vas deferens, actually, with regard to unintelligent design. We're going to go ahead and we still got the one line. We're going to go ahead and try and take some more calls again. I want to remind everybody that we'll be going to Threadgills after the show. We're on for another 13 minutes or so, or
13
12.
minutes. We do need callers now. I'm out of material.
That's all right, because I got extra stuff to talk about if we're stuck without anybody. But quickly, since I breezed through the announcements earlier on, I might as well get some of them out of the way now. We'll be at Threadgills tonight after the show. We're on to 6 o'clock. We'll be there around 6:30, 6:45. Any atheist or atheist-friendly person is welcome to attend. You can email us at tv@atheist-community.org. You can visit the website at www.atheist-community.org. You can also feel free to visit www.ironchariots.org if you're interested in counter-apologetics and participating in discussions along those lines. In addition to the various ACA meetings that are going on, I want to remind all the ACA members that in addition to the National Day of Reason and having Vic Stinger down as a guest, next Sunday, May 6th, is also the elections for the ACA. If you're currently a member, please participate. If your membership has lapsed, it's no problem at all. You can renew it on that day. You'll still be eligible to vote. We've got the information posted at the website and on our Yahoo list about who's running for the board of directors. And so we're looking forward to having a good turnout there and continuing to do more things next year, including the possibility of a building and branching out into other other media aspects as they present themselves, or media opportunities as they present themselves. So we'll go ahead and right now, and we'll try to take this call again. Hello?
Hello?
Yes, is this Karpal?
Yeah, sir. I got a comment about the previous talk. I believe that caterpillar could turn into a butterfly. But
We can't hear you. Is there-
I believe that a caterpillar could turn into a butterfly, and a tadpole into a frog. But I do
Yeah.
not believe that a fish can turn into a cow.
Okay. I don't believe
That's
a fish
true.
can turn into
Fish
a cow
can't
either.
turn into cows.
You are fucking crazy. You're crazy.
I can't hear him.
We lost him.
I can't hear him at all. And I'll go out on a limb and say it was a prank anyway.
Yeah, probably.
Considering the name, there's this really popular kind of flash animation from several years ago where this guy
really?
named Karpal was calling up to say that their daughter kicked his dog or something, and it was amusing.
Okay.
So
All right, we won't take Karpal again, but we do have the lines open for another 10 minutes.
So there was we tried to do a number of things over the past few weeks. There was an article in the Austin Statesman about myself and the show, and we received a lot of email about it. I received some actual snail mail, a few letters, a couple of nasty grams, and a telephone call actually. And actually, as it turns out, there are two Matt Dillahunties in the Austin area. Only one of them doesn't normally go by Matt, but so. I'm easy to find. I'm easy to contact. You can email TV at atheist-community.org. You can email president at atheist-community.org. I'll give you my personal email address. I've had people call me at home. That's fine, but don't go to the one in the phone book because that's not me. I'd rather not bother other people, which is one of the reasons why people have asked why you don't put the telephone number for the show up on the broadcast that we put over the internet, and why we don't read it off, and that's because other people use this studio during hours when we're not here, and we'd rather not have the number out there so that they get flooded with calls when we're not here to answer them. So try to keep calls separated to the appropriate shows. One of the things that was in the article in the Statesman was a comment that I made about 2 Kings chapter 2 verses 23 through 25, which was the story about Elisha and the curse that caused 2 bears to come kill 42 kids. The newspaper article hit it very briefly. I received lots of comments about this, including someone who used to be a Bible teacher at the Hays County Jail, mailed me the actual Bible study lesson that she used to cover this particular story. Now, I appreciate that, and I apologize that I haven't gotten back to you beforehand. One of the reasons is that there's absolutely nothing new here. This isn't, I wasn't under some delusion about what the actual story was. The guts of the story is that Elisha's walking into this town, and a gang of youths, or a group of kids, however you want to translate it, says to him, "Go up, bald head, go up." And he curses them in the name of God, and God sends 2 bears.
What does go up mean? What
Well,
do they
I'll
mean
get
by
to
that?
that.
I've never been clear on
I'll
that.
get to that because she includes that in the explanation. And he curses them in the name of God, and God has sends 2 she-bears to kill 42 kids. Now, there's some discussion about, well, my concern is how do you rationalize that situation? How do you make that out to be a good thing? And there's several ways to do it. Number one is to think that it never actually happened. That's what I believe. I don't believe any of this ever actually happened. Number two is that it's not properly represented, that the story's been altered or changed from what actually happened. Okay, I can buy that as long as we leave out the supernatural. Maybe some kids, some youths, whatever, were tragically torn by bears, and then somebody made up the story afterwards as a justification to say, hey, this is why you shouldn't poke fun at messengers from God. The other one is to believe that it actually happened and think that it's justified. And that seems to be the most common. What I was sent was an explanation that, well, why would God do this? And as it turns out, we're talking about not little kids, according to this person's interpretation or translation, not little kids, but a gang of youths, a gang of people who wanted to continue to do evil, who were under the guidance of their former queen Jezebel, and they were evildoers who wanted to keep doing evil. And Elijah, who was the teacher of Elisha, had been claimed to have been taken up in the clouds. So that's where the go up was. They were basically, telling him to go to heaven, I guess, instead of go to hell, because they didn't want his teaching around here. They wanted to keep on sinning. And I'll say this. I'll take everything you've written as a valid, true explanation. For the sake of argument, I'll say yes, that's what all of those interpretations are supposed to mean. And it still doesn't justify what happened. If you want to believe this story and write it off and say, well, these were a bunch of evil people who were threatening Elisha, and then God punished them by having bears rip them apart, and they had it coming and they deserved it, then, okay, fine, you're able to rationalize it that way. But you're now just as immoral as the God that you believe in. Because the fact of the matter is, nowhere in this story does it say that those people did anything other than threaten verbally. And if you think that having bears come and rip people to shreds for making a verbal threat, regardless of who they were, how mean they are, if you think that's a just punishment, that they had it coming, and that this is the action of a loving, morally correct God, then your morality has been just as corrupted as everybody else who buys into this thing. Personally, I'd rather say, if there is a God, he ain't like that. And if he is like that, I don't want to worship him. The more rational conclusion is that the story is just made up. It's not true. It's the result of a bunch of barbarians roaming around trying to make sense of the world and using whatever position and power that they could to make sure that people didn't disobey. We're going to make these rules and you're going to follow them, because if you don't, God's going to kick your ass. It's really a simple thing. I appreciate having sent this to me. It didn't teach me anything new. I'd read the information before that there's other interpretations are gang of use. It doesn't matter. I don't care if they were Crips. I don't care if they had tack nines pointed at Elisha saying, get your ass out of town. Until one of them actually does something that's physical, that goes beyond a threat, then ripping him to shreds with bears isn't justified yet.
Well, God believes in preemptive war.
Yeah.
But, I'm sorry, I don't grant that any of that makes sense. And I know you don't either.
I said for the sake of argument.
You're just being helpful. But, there is absolutely nothing in the text that indicates that it's a gang of unruly teenagers and they're threatening him. You can come up with that, just like you can come up with anything to say that. You could even say, when they said kids, they actually meant big ugly monsters with, who were sitting on him at that moment. But the Bible doesn't say any of that.
Yeah, it's a silly thing that I was willing to grant just for the sake of argument. Basically the whole explanation was basically a kind of a winding road through, well, this means this, and this means this, and these people were evil, so they had it coming. Sorry, your so they had it coming argument doesn't fly.
Right, and if any author had written, some kids went and said go up, if any modern popular author would go up and write some kids said go up and then they got killed by bears, and then he was called on to explain what was up with that passage, and he said, actually these were unruly teenagers who were threatening the guy. The only conclusion is, you suck as an author. You are terrible at communicating.
Yeah.
And I would hope that God is a better author than that.
Well, I guess there's some confusion about how much God wrote and how much man wrote. I was going to take 3
seconds.
We're out.
We got one more guy.
No, we got 40 seconds left.
Oh.
Thanks everybody for tuning in. Please be sure and tune in next week. We're going to have Vic Stinger here with us as a guest. He'll be talking about his book. Anybody who wants to join us down at Threadgills, you're welcome to, as long as you're not coming down to preach, proselytize, or provoke. You can email me.
Oops.
That was 30